Film and movies have always been one of my biggest passions. I remember when my dad got his first camcorder. He still has it, and aside from needing a massive recharge, I'm pretty sure everything still functions the way it should. Though I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the fact that the cassette tapes used for recording are relics of a bygone era in home movie media. Growing up, I never really paid attention to the trailers dropping on TV promoting a movie coming out to theaters all that much. Most of the previews I saw were at the opening of VHS home copies whenever we'd go to the rental store near our house to catch up on whatever we missed that hit the multiplexes. I distinctly remember seeing only 2 movie trailers on TV during my early childhood, before my family moved back from Arizona to California. The first was in 1988 for the remake of the 1950s sci-fi horror classic, The Blob, which made me terrified of the plumbing in our home for the next 6 months. And the first few teasers shown on TV for the 1989 Tim Burton film, Batman. We saw the movie in 1989, so that summer was huge for me because we made the move to California in 1989, so that summer was a huge time for me because it was awash with multiple trips to the theater to catch showings of both Batman and Ghostbusters 2, which released the same summer. From then on, I got into movies in a big way. Not like Abed Nadir big, where the only thing I could relate to was film and television. But I did see movies as a way to kind of help me understand the world, because even at a young age, I was already developing ideas in my head for stories I would later play out with my action figures and other toys, which would go on to later influence what I do as a fiction writer.
Cool. Cool.
One particular memorable summer was in 1996, just 7 years after we moved back to California. I had just graduated 8th grade, and the day after graduation, I spent the next 3 weeks or so traveling through Texas and Oklahoma with my grandfather, who happened to be an Oklahoma native. Let me tell you, there is nothing like being in the Sooner State during tornado season and watching Twister on the big screen and getting a notification mid-movie that we might have to cancel the screening and find shelter because a storm might be touching down just outside of town.
The suck zone.
But that summer, I was also introduced to the first in a line of 8 films that would come to dominate my own personal movie collection through the rest of my life. And that film is Mission Impossible, starring Tom Cruise. By this point, Cruise was already a household name with mega hits like Top Gun, Days of Thunder, and Rain Man. While he was one of my least favorite parts of Interview with a Vampire, based on the Anne Rice novel of the same name, he seemed to have a lot of fun playing a semi-villainous character in his portrayal of Lestat. And that is a key takeaway I have from most of his films. Cruise is a man who puts all of himself into a project, and he seems to thoroughly enjoy the work he does, including and especially the stunt work involved. This brings me neatly back to Mission Impossible. I grew up watching spy flicks with my dad, like some of the classic James Bond movies. To this day, I maintain the 2 best Bond actors were Connery and Craig, even if the latter's character arc fell flat by the end. And I will maintain the 2 best Bond movies were Casino Royale from 2006, which is Craig's first outing, and GoldenEye, which was Pierce Brosnan's first go at the character. It also happened to be the first Bond movie I saw in theaters, and it premiered just 6 months before the summer release of Mission Impossible. I never grew up watching the Mission Impossible TV series. It always aired too late at night for a small child, but I was vaguely aware of some of the running motifs in the show, like the ticking clock premise, key to most spy thrillers, the theme song, the choice of whether or not the agents would take the mission, and some world-ending MacGuffin that needed to be contained or thwarted. The movies were no different. In fact, the opening sequence of the 1996 original opens in media res, or in the middle of a mission already in progress, and Jack, played by Emilio Estevez, in an almost cameo role, checks his watch out of concern for one of their agents who was placed under a certain type of anesthesia to make her appear dead to force their target to confess to a crime. It then picks up with the TV series regular character, Jim Phelps, who was the director of the IMF. This gets changed up a bit at the start of the first film. Phelps has returned to simply being a team leader, receiving mission briefings and assignments from director Eugene Kittredge. From the very outset, the audience was made aware of the film's target MacGuffin, the CIA's NOC list. For those of you unfamiliar with the term, NOC, or NOC, stands for non-official cover. These are the operatives working in other parts of the world who are the top of their training classes at the CIA, who go deep undercover, and if they get burned, the agency will disavow any knowledge of their actions. We get introduced to Phelps' team, the aforementioned Jack, Hannah Williams, Sarah Davies, Ethan Hunt, who's played by Tom Cruise, and Claire Phelps, Jim's wife. I've honestly never been a fan of a husband-wife team-up. It takes the objectivity of the job out of it, but I guess that's a common thread through the films, which we will talk about later on. The mission to track their mark, a man named Alexander Golitsyn, who breaks into the US Embassy in Prague to steal a copy of the knock list to sell it, goes pear-shaped when, in quick succession, every member of the team, including Phelps, dies, leaving Hunt the only survivor. A lot of longtime fans of the series hated this because of Phelps being a staple of the franchise, but it was a great way to switch out the cast ensemble and put the main star in the forefront of the plot. Hunt is then accused of the betrayal and of being the mole by director Kittredge, and the manhunt for Hunt begins shortly after. Ethan later figures out how to connect with the real mole's buyer, an arms dealer named Max, as well as learning that Claire survived because she followed the abort command when stuff hit the fan. Together, they put in place a new team, including Franz Krieger, played by Jean Reno, and Luther Stickle, played by Ving Rhames, who is the only other character from the '96 original to appear in every film besides Cruise's character. This new team of supposedly dead or disavowed agents breaks into the secure vault at the CIA HQ in Langley, Virginia, to steal the full and complete knock list to sell, quote-unquote, to Max. Ultimately, Ethan's plan is to use the real list to draw the CIA to Max and have her arrested, as well as drawing out the person who killed his team. By this point, Ethan puts a few things together, and after discovering Jim was still alive, realizes it was Phelps, his mentor, who betrayed and murdered the rest of the team, and Claire was his plant from the very beginning. Longtime fans of the series hated this too, because it vilified Phelps. But the logic behind the character's decisions actually makes sense. There was a cold ruthlessness to Phelps in the original TV show and its late 80s revival. It made sense that he'd turn on his own people because it just wasn't satisfying enough for him. Beyond that, it sets a trend that we see throughout the rest of the film series of supposedly long-time trusted operatives and allies turning out to be the real threat. Obviously, Hunt and Stickle survive and succeed. Phelps kills Claire, and both he and Krieger are killed by Hunt in the film's climax, bringing us to the end of the movie where Ethan questions returning to the IMF.
I just don't know why I'd be doing it.
It goes unsaid, but he fears turning out like Phelps had, which actually speaks volumes of the moral compass that we see Hunt demonstrate throughout the rest of the movies. I'm going to get through the next few movie breakdowns in quick succession for the sake of time. Part 2 sees Hunt in a more action-centric mission, having to track down Sean Ambrose, yet another IMF operative turned would-be terrorist who wants to release a deadly biological pathogen into the world while owning the controlling stock of the company who manufactures the antivirus, all so that he can make a ton of money. While Phelps' goals were to make money to retire with after being kicked around by his government, Ambrose just is greedy, and he's a sociopath. Hunt stops the release of the virus and saves the day in just the nick of time. Part 3 jumps ahead a few years. Hunt is semi-retired, taking up training new and younger operatives for IMF missions and getting ready to be married. He's called back into the field to rescue an agent he personally certified, which leads him down a rabbit hole into investigating and capturing an arms dealer named Owen Davian, played by the late great Philip Seymour Hoffman. Part 3 has plenty of action, but focuses more on the intrigue. Davian manages to escape and implicates Hunt as a potential rogue asset, forcing him to go on the lam and retrieve probably the most mysterious of all the MacGuffins in the franchise, the Rabbit's Foot, or as newcomer Benji Dunn, played by Simon Pegg, calls it, the anti-god. During the completion of the mission, Hunt discovers Billy Crudup's Musgrave is also acting as a bit of a turncoat. In the next installment, Ghost Protocol is a solid spy thriller with more clear stakes than Part 3. Which I'll come back to later. The film's subtitle is a reference to the IMF suddenly closing its doors after 2 missions, the second specifically involving Hunt, fail spectacularly. Especially that second one, since a bomb went off at the Kremlin with the intention to kill Hunt, or, as the story progresses, implicate him as the aggressor. Hunt and his team have little in the way of assets and zero backup, really forcing the team's ability to adapt on the fly as they hunt down a would-be nuclear terrorist codenamed Cobalt, who wants to use nuclear war to clean the planet's slate and start over to force world peace. Hunt and his team narrowly succeed, and he walks into the night, getting a new mission setting up the threat of an anti-IMF organization called the Syndicate. Then we get Rogue Nation as the 5th installment, which really ups the stakes as Hunt is introduced to the syndicate and their leader, Solomon Lane. Hunt is on the run after he's suspected of killing an IMF agent in London, and he, and later his team, reluctantly teams up with quasi-disavowed NOC MI6 operative Ilsa Faust to secure a black box phantom drive, which would give the syndicate access to billions in hard currency funded by the British government to pay for all their terrorism. Then we get part 6, Fallout, which I've got to say, I love the double meaning in dealing with the idea of repercussions of decisions made in the previous entries, as well as the term used in the aftermath of nuclear devastation, which is again at the heart of this film. Hunt and his team are tasked with trying to infiltrate the sale of weapons-grade nuclear materials through a splinter cell of syndicate members called the Apostles, led by a mysterious terrorist known as John Lark. Hunt takes on the moniker to infiltrate a party thrown by the White Widow, played deliciously by Vanessa Kirby. Come to find out, August Walker, played by Henry Cavill, is the CIA assassin sent to keep tabs on Hunt, and is actually the real Lark, and he was working with a now freed Solomon Lane. Finally, we have the two-part conclusion in Dead Reckoning and The Final Reckoning, which just came out this year. With the former being a nautical term for calculating one's position by estimating the direction and distance traveled, rather than using landmarks, astronomical observations, or electronic navigational data. While there are flesh and blood threats, especially in the form of CIA agents sent by Kittredge as the current director and a mysterious assassin named Gabriel, the main antagonist is a semi-omniscient artificial intelligence algorithm called the Entity. Hunt is first tasked with acquiring one half of a special key, which is seen earlier for accessing a data drive in a Russian nuclear missile sub. The Entity knows whoever can access that drive can essentially control it, and so it decides to wipe out humanity by launching all of the world's biggest nuclear arsenals simultaneously, but only after it has secured itself in the most remote and impenetrable bunker in the world. There are a lot of themes strung throughout 8 movies spanning nearly 30 years. Certainly, first and foremost, is the theme of betrayal. Ethan Hunt gets betrayed by his mentor and his government because he's the only known member of his team left alive. And Claire Phelps plays him for a honeypot, a classic espionage tactic where an attractive operative uses their sexuality to manipulate an asset. He gets betrayed by another member of the IMF when Sean Ambrose uses his identity to double Hunt when initially intercepting the scientist who created Chimera and its antivirus. That sting of betrayal gets internalized threefold because it was Musgrave that sent Hunt's trainee, Agent Ferris, played by Kerry Russell, to hunt down Davian, getting her killed and later off-screen informing Davian who Hunt is and how to target Ethan's wife Julia. The fact Musgrave reveals himself to Hunt just seals his fate because I'm sure it doesn't sit well with him that he keeps having people betraying him at every pass. While there's no real sense of betrayal in Ghost Protocol, there is in Rogue Nation and Fallout. Solomon Lane hasn't betrayed Hunt, though he has targeted people Hunt works with and cares for, and he betrayed his own government as a part of the syndicate. In fact, Lane shares a lot of similarities with Jim Phelps in that both men saw the way their governments got rich off the intelligence gathering and sacrifices both men performed, only to have it go completely unnoticed or ignored because they were non-official government operatives. The main difference is Lane took Phelps' sentiments to an extreme, but August Walker, aka John Lark, takes things to an even further extreme. Lane's intentions in Fallout are to get sweet revenge on Hunt and Ilsa for capturing him and ruining his life's work. Walker, on the other hand, is a true believer in his cause and really wants to strategically wipe out and reset the human race. And in his case, he is like Cobalt from Ghost Protocol, though he makes it more personal in that he specifically targets a medical camp where Ethan's now ex-wife is working. On top of that, Walker betrays his own government, including his own mentor, who is the CIA director. While betrayal isn't as much of a thread in the last 2 films, it does show up because Hunt still has issues left over with Kittredge, who returns in these last 2 entries. But this isn't the only thread. There's also the sense of justice and revenge playing throughout the films. You can clearly see Hunt not wanting to harm Jim or Claire when they reveal he's being played by both of them. But you can see a fire in him when he learns Krieger, whom Claire recommended he recruit for the Langley job, was working with Jim all along. He deliberately detonates a bomb on Jim and Krieger's getaway chopper. He has personal stakes against Ambrose in Part 2, and while he initially lets his enemy live, he eventually guns the psycho down. His fight with Davian at the end of Part 3 is personal since the villain threatened to kill Ethan's wife, and Musgrave gets himself shot by Julia when he comes in to collect the rabbit's foot. The stakes aren't as personal for Ethan in Ghost Protocol, but they are for his team member Jane, played by Paula Patton. One of their targets in the film is Léa Seydoux's Sabine Moreau, an assassin who killed Jane's teammate and lover Hannaway, played by Josh Holloway from Lost. And there are additional personal stakes with the way both Solomon Lane deliberately targets Hunt's team members and ex-wife during Rogue Nation and Fallout. While Hunt has no intention to kill Lane because then he has no evidence of the Syndicate without him, there is some no-holds-barred extreme prejudice with the way Hunt goes after Walker. The personal stakes get even greater in the last two films because of Gabriel's involvement. The audience is given a brief glimpse as to the shared history between Hunt and Gabriel, and we get the sense Gabriel killed someone Hunt loved. But we don't get anything more than that. Because of how they broke the story into two halves, I think it would have been better to have that personal stake be an interesting prologue to open the final reckoning, to help explain just how personal everything is for Ethan. Unfortunately, the audience gets no real details into their backstory, so the personal stakes and sense of revenge aren't super strong. But all of this segues into the next to last recurring theme, and that is Ethan Hunt's moral compass. When it comes to doing everything to make the world right, Hunt is like a dog chasing after a bone. He knows he's the lead suspect in a mole hunt and still goes after the knock list to flush out the people who betrayed him and killed his team members. Despite being given explicit instructions from his handler to acquire a sample of the Chimera virus and to consider his asset, Naya Nordoff Hall, relatively expendable or collateral, he destroys all traces of Chimera so it cannot be replicated or weaponized, let alone released, as well as saving Naya in the process. Again, even though he's being hunted because he's implicated in helping Davian escape custody, he still goes out of his way to do what he needs to do to protect his wife while also taking out a dangerous arms dealer. He's disavowed yet again and on the run from Russian intelligence to stop Cobalt. He's on the lam from his own government, who doesn't even believe the Syndicate exists, while also in the process of trying to defund the IMF, but he manages to capture Lane even though he'd personally like to kill the man. In Fallout, Hunt is required to assume and then implicated to actually be John Lark, a move which forces him to help break Lane out of custody for the White Widow so she can broker him to a potential client. While it goes against his moral code to let Lane loose, he knows and hopes it will help him stop the real John Lark. In the two-part finale, Ethan again is railing against his own government, though this time he feels more in the dark than ever before, considering they wanted him to eliminate Ilsa Faust, which he doesn't do to people he cares about. Not only that, he has his own superiors working behind the scenes to cover up their own involvement in everything that has led to the events of the last two films. At every pass, Hunt wrestles with a dilemma. Should he continue doing what he knows needs to be done, or should he seek out the sort of justice that he'd like to enact on his adversaries? You can see this in his face when he locks eyes with Jim Phelps and Franz Krieger, when he battles Sean Ambrose on the Australian coast, when he's got an explosive charge priming in his head while he's pummeling Owen Davian. It's not personal for him as he deals with Cobalt, who willingly sacrifices himself to try and stop the spy, but you again get that facial expression from Hunt when he's playing mental chess with Lane, while there is a literal ticking clock built into the bomb vest strapped to Benji during the climax of Rogue Nation. We see it again when he goes after Walker in the helicopter and their mountaintop fight, and whenever he is face-to-face with either Kittredge or his final nemesis Gabriel. But every time, Hunt's moral compass wins out. Kittredge refers to it in Dead Reckoning as his fatal flaw, and the late IMF director Hunley, played by Alec Baldwin, mentions in Fallout that there's some part of Hunt that won't let him sacrifice a team member just to get the job done. Maybe it's a hero complex, which would be a video for another time. But Ethan Hunt is a man who wants to save everyone he can, especially those he cares about.
Every search for a hero must begin with something that every hero requires: a villain.
This line of dialogue, spoken by Chimera scientist Dr. Nikorovich in Mission Impossible 2, is the crux of this section. From a storytelling perspective, a hero is only as good as the villain forces them to be. Superman has Lex Luthor. Batman has the Joker. Luke Skywalker has Darth Vader. Sherlock Holmes has Professor James Moriarty, and Ethan Hunt? Well, his enemies come in a variety of shapes and sizes, but are usually born out of the very intelligence networks, backstabbing, and statecraft in which he operates. Let's take a breakdown of the prime adversary in each of the films. Jim Phelps was Ethan's mentor, friend, and team leader. He, alongside his wife and their ally Krieger, were either considered dead or disavowed and used their status to not only double-cross Hunt, but to sell out the IMF and the CIA for millions of dollars. Sean Ambrose was an active IMF operative who went rogue while doubling as Hunt to get his hands on one of the worst biowarfare agents in existence, and his goal was to take control of the pharmaceutical company who engineered it to peddle the cure and make billions of dollars. Owen Davian wanted the rabbit's foot to sell to Musgrave so the US government could get their hands on it and have some kind of control over the global powers. Ironically enough, after both adversaries died, Hunt just handed it over and money never changed hands. Cobalt was a fanatic, but he was a true believer in instigating a nuclear war between the US and Russia to start a new world order and change to save the human race. He didn't care about the money. Solomon Lane really cared about the money, but only because he needed the funds in the digital vault in order to finance his various operations with the syndicate. Walker followed on the footsteps of both Cobalt and Lane. He didn't care about the money. He just wanted to kill a few billion people around the world to change the world. And then that brings us to Gabriel and the Entity. The former had personal ties to Hunt and was part of the reason Ethan joined the IMF in the first place. The Entity, and spoiler alert if you haven't seen The Final Reckoning, was the culmination of everything that came before. Each of these villains represents some facet in Hunt's own character, forcing him to ask himself questions like, could I be capable of betraying my own team members and the people I love for the sake of what I want? Clearly, Hunt cannot, because he goes out of his way to save his team members time and again. He even tried to stop Jim from killing Claire. Ambrose, and more Musgrave than Davian, challenge Hunt to ponder whether or not he's capable of betraying his government through going rogue and obtaining power. Again, his moral compass kicks in, and while he hands over the rabbit's foot, he did destroy Chimera to take them out of the hands of people who would use them for devious reasons. But we'll put a pin in that for just a moment. Like Cobalt and Walker, he's a true believer in his mission. That part never wavers. While he doesn't give in to the impulses like Gabriel is directed to do by the Entity, Hunt listens to the AI to some extent to get an understanding of what needs to be done and how to do it to save the world. But Solomon Lane is the real linchpin in this argument. He's a perfect reflection of Ethan Hunt. Both men have felt the sting of betrayal at the hands of their own governments time and again, having been disavowed at one time or another and to be on the run as rogue operatives. If you read between the lines, the IMF, and more specifically Hunt, have thwarted Lane's operations on more than one occasion, and it's entirely possible, even probable, that's why Lane directed the syndicate's operations to select targets that would draw Hunt out into the field. Lane forces Hunt to ask himself, could I ever become a global terrorist and do something worse than selling out my government like Phelps tried to do? Ultimately, the answer to these questions is a resounding no. But we do see Ethan frequently do his own thing, using his skills at adaptation to complete his mission. August Walker even makes this same case when he tries to frame Hunt as John Lark, exploiting the IMF's history of disavowing and endangering Hunt, suggesting the betrayals may have encouraged Hunt to go rogue, and he ends up creating another dark mirror in himself because Walker's description of Hunt's potential motivation is basically him confessing his own motivations for why he became the actual John Lark. Ethan's choice to infiltrate Langley to acquire the knock list, his choice to infiltrate Biosite to destroy the Chimera virus despite being ordered to acquire a sample, his choice to exfiltrate to Shanghai and acquire the rabbit's foot to save his wife, his choice to pursue Lane and the Syndicate, and every other rogue operation he does as a means of accomplishing these impossible missions are all intrinsic to his fierce independent streak. He often takes on the more dangerous or risky tasks of the mission to protect the rest of his team.
Hunt's target will be the Chimera, stored and manufactured at Biosite on the 42nd floor. If you look at Hunt's operational history, and I have, he invariably favors misdirection over confrontation. No. Hunt will prefer to enter biosite somewhere from the top where security is minimal. He'll undoubtedly engage in some aerobatic insanity before he'll risk harming a hair on a security guard's head.
Even Sean Ambrose comments on Hunt's tenacity for doing some kind of high-risk, to himself, stunt as a form of misdirection before harming any security guards. Ultimately, while Ambrose's motivations are weak, they are certainly a lot stronger than those of Gabriel from the last two films. Ambrose was only in it for the money and was just a raging sociopath. He just wanted to be rich and in control, and you could see his bent toward full-on narcissism. Gabriel, while certainly a sociopath in his own right, had so much potential, and it gets wasted because the audience is left with way too many unanswered questions, such as, why was he doing the bidding of the entity in the first place? What did the entity promise him to get him to comply? What was the deeper nature of his connection to Hunt? And why were they enemies in the first place? These questions invariably become violations of Chekhov's gun, which is a storytelling element that says if you introduce something in the story, it needs closure. If you introduce a gun in the first act, it must be fired by the end of the story. If you introduce a potential bomb in the first act, like Fallout did, then it has to be set to detonate before the end of the story. And if you introduce a villain with mysterious origins and motivations, then you need to explore them in detail without wasting time so that element of the story has closure. And this brings us neatly to one of the things that makes the Mission Impossible franchise stand out is the mostly consistent use of cause and effect in the storytelling process. As the series progressed and you are avidly paying attention to more than just the spectacle, you can see the way the various story elements from earlier installments thread into the narrative of subsequent films. Take the knock list from the first film. An argument could be made that if Phelps successfully sold it to Max, the arms dealer, she could have in turn been the person brokering it to Solomon Lane, so he had a fresh list of operatives he could have brought into the syndicate, had they all been burned and disavowed by the CIA and any other government to which they were connected. But the way Hunt is handled in that first film could have been the impetus to give someone like Sean Ambrose cause to want to jump ship and go rogue with a troop of experts he knew and trusted, as he did in the opening of Mission Impossible 2. In fact, it's entirely possible that all of the men he worked with, such as Hugh Stamp and Wallace, were members of his own IMF team, and it's even more plausible that, while not true believers to the same extent, they may have been some of Solomon Lane's first recruits, given the fact that they were well funded to hole up in a cushy house in Sydney Harbor. At the end of the first film, Max is seen trying to orchestrate a mutually beneficial arrangement between her organization and Kittredge. This arrangement gets referenced later when we meet the White Widow, who is Max's daughter, and we see that arrangement play out as the Widow hands over Solomon Lane to CIA Director Sloan, played by Angela Bassett. And with Max's organization switching more into brokering information and intelligence rather than weapons, that left a huge opening for a man like Owen Davian, who was specifically targeting the Rabbit's Foot for a mystery client who turned out to be Musgrave. And that's where we get our biggest, most interconnecting thread. The Rabbit's Foot wasn't a biological weapon like Benji insinuated. While it comes at the cost of a bit of retconning, especially given the Rabbit's Foot container had large biohazard labels on it, that particular MacGuffin turns out to be the initial source code for the entity. Once it was handed over by Hunt, it was eventually co-opted by future National Intelligence Director Denlinger, played by Cary Elwes, who had it covertly hack into the operating system of Russia's newest tactical missile sub, the Sevastopol, where the original entity merged with an AI program inside the sub's mainframe, causing the two programs to merge into one threat. The entity, being self-aware and having access to all of the internet, probably got its digital hands on the treatise written and spoken about by Cobalt prior to the events of Ghost Protocol and assumed total nuclear annihilation of the human species was the best option for it. Very Skynet, but that's the decision it made. Then you've got the Syndicate and all of its activities, which alongside Hunt's history and some influences from Cobalt, prompts August Walker to create the John Lark alias and draft his manifesto. But Cobalt's, Lane's, and Walker's failures become teaching moments for the entity to create plans within plans to make its machinations for global nuclear destruction as foolproof as possible. However, as seemingly omniscient and prescient as the entity is, it's still myopic in its attempts because it fails to see the variable that can completely derail its attempts: human nature. Its own desire for self-preservation is a mirror of all of humanity's collective need for self-preservation as well. The system was fallible because human beings are eventually and invariably fallible. It's that imperfection in those unknowables that create its own downfall and subsequently Gabriel's. The phrase true believers keeps getting repeated throughout this essay, whether it's a reference to Cobalt's nuclear fanaticism, or Lane's need to bring down the governments of the world, or Walker's desire to see the world burn to appease his own frustrations and bitterness. But Gabriel and Hunt are two sides of the same coin. They are both true believers in their own causes. Hunt, of course, makes it his mission to save the world from whatever threat crosses his path, and he becomes more obsessed with completing his missions, especially in the wake of Mission Impossible 2. While some view it as the weakest entry for a variety of reasons, there is a flow of storytelling that underscores Ethan's need to be the one to get the job done. There's a throwaway line from Fallout where Julia, Ethan's estranged ex-wife, whom we first met in the third film, tells Luther that she understood Ethan's need to be in the field because she knew he worried that if he was constantly worried about her, after what happened in Shanghai, that he wouldn't be able to forgive himself if something happened out in the world and he could have done something to stop it. Now, jumping back to the second film, the reason why Ambrose doubled Hunt at the film's opening was because he was sent on an assignment to exfiltrate Nikorovich from Australia when Hunt went on vacation without telling anybody. And Ethan tried to live a normal life after that mission by stepping out of the field to become a trainer so he could have a bit more of a work-life balance. Between the events of those two films, Ethan makes a choice to give up the happiness he desires so that he can be the person stopping evils in the world. But let's flip back to Gabriel. The choice of his name is interesting. He's the only villain in the franchise with just a singular name. Gabriel could have been his given name, or it could have been his surname. We have no way of knowing. But the name literally translates from Hebrew as messenger of God, which plays into his own beliefs. He reveres the entity in Dead Reckoning as a sort of deity. Every time it tells him to do something, he does it with dogmatic ferocity. He follows the entity's predictions to the letter because he doesn't stop to consider the small percentage that in doing so he's actually influencing the outcome of the probabilities. Case in point, the entity knows Hunt didn't kill Palm Clementif's Paris during their fight in Venice, and that created a window of doubt in her mind. The entity therefore generates a prediction model with a strong likelihood of Paris turning on Gabriel and the entity. Instead of continuing to work with her and trusting her, Gabriel interprets this as an inevitability, which it wasn't until he betrayed Paris and attempted to kill her. In fact, Gabriel is so trusting of his technology that he doesn't stop to consider what happens when it fails. Everything he does is calculated and precise, right down to his jump off the Orient Express or any of the other escapes he makes throughout Dead Reckoning. This inability to adapt, the opposite of Hunt, gets first notice when he's trying to escape Hunt and Grace, and the entity recodes the locks of his escape route and leads Hunt to the sarcophagus it used to speak with Gabriel. In fact, right up to the end, Gabriel is so trusting of his tech, he doesn't pay attention to his surroundings during his final airborne fight with Ethan. He's wearing a parachute and thinks he's safe because he's got the only one. He lets go of a strap and opens the chute only to slam crotch first into the biplane's tail rudder, the chute opening and catching the wind, thus slamming his face into the rest of the rudder in probably one of the most hilarious death scenes in the franchise. But there are other more subtle threads of cause and effect within the franchise. For example, Jim Phelps' son, Jasper Briggs, played by Shea Wiggum, appears in the final two films, and Hunt recognizes Briggs for who he is. It's hard to say if Briggs' mother was Claire Phelps from the first film. Probably not, given the fact that Wiggum is 56 years old and Emmanuelle Biert, the French actress who played Claire, is only 5 years younger than him. Then there is Alana, the White Widow, Mitsopoulos, and her brother Zola. There's a subtle foreshadowing of dialogue when Hunt first meets her while posing as Lark. She refers to him as a paradox. Only the second time someone called Hunt that in the series. Of course, it is revealed that arms dealer Max from the first film is Alana and Zola's mother. And throughout the rest of the series, we do get to see what happened to Ethan's ex-wife, Julia. There's a brief glimpse of her at the end of Ghost Protocol, and then we are reintroduced to her in person during Fallout, where she aids Luther in disabling one of the nuclear devices activated by Walker during the climax. And there are smaller roles played by minor characters. Kittredge is the only current or former IMF director since Alec Baldwin's Hunley to appear in more than one installment, making Kittredge's presence a nice bookend for the series. Then there's actor Rolf Saxon playing CIA analyst William Donlow, who appears as another character bookending for the franchise as the Black Vault operator from the first film who mans a radar facility in Alaska. Hardcore fans will recognize the reference without it being told to them, but just in case,
I want him manning a radar tower in Alaska by the end of the day. Just mail him his clothes.
it wasn't hyperbole, and it flows nicely. There is even another character in the film referred to as Max's companion in the credits. The actor playing him is Andreas Wisniewski. He's seen sporting a long blonde ponytail. If he looked familiar in MI1 to American audiences, he should, since he played the last of Hans Gruber's henchmen in Die Hard, who gets shot down by Sergeant Powell, played by Reginald Vell Johnson. Wisniewski would appear just 3 films later, midway through Ghost Protocol, as quote-unquote the Fog's contact, with whom Hunt has to interact with in an almost identical fashion as with Max before he's allowed to meet the Fog, a Russian arms dealer. But perhaps one of the deepest cuts is the names given to the villains. Tying this back to the previous section. As mentioned before, the name Gabriel means messenger of God. But let's look at the etymology of all the others. At least 3 of the antagonists have names with derivations from John. The most obvious is the John Lark alias, but then you have Sean Ambrose and Owen Davian. Both Davian and Lane have kingly names. Davian meaning of David, and Solomon is obvious, which are ties to kings from the Bible. Even Kurt Hendricks, aka Cobalt, has a surname derived from the name Henry, which means home ruler, and his first name roughly translates as brave counsel, given he was a professor who served as a nuclear strategist. But the far more interesting names were August Walker and Solomon Lane. Lane's name literally translates as peaceful way or path, which is ironic given he followed a very strict path and not a single step of which was at all peaceful. Walker has a similar sense of irony to his name. August means venerable or respectable, and Walker is someone who literally walks. Nothing Walker did was respectable, and he literally walked the same true believer path as Lane and Hendricks, who came before them. But there is something to consider for the protagonists as well. Ethan's name originally comes from Hebrew, meaning solid, enduring, firm, which we see on full display throughout the course of the films. Even Luther and Benji, 2 of Hunt's more steadfast team members, have etymologies that play into their character development. Luther means people or army, and Luther is definitely Ethan's people. They become fast friends through the course of the series. And Benji, which is short for Benjamin, means son of my right hand. While not to be taken literally, Benji is a tech guru and hacker just like Luther, and often fills in the gaps left by Luther when it's required. It's hard to say if these name choices were deliberate during the pre-production phases of the films, but it's fun to explore these possibilities. It's been 29 years, and if there's one thing I've really appreciated about the Mission Impossible franchise, it's the fact that it has more consistency running throughout 8 films than other franchises have in either a much longer span of time or in a shorter span with far more movies. While there are no such things as perfect movies, I will forever appreciate the value these films offer. For one, the dedication their star has given to making some of the best movies worth seeing in cinemas, and 2, the practical artwork produced by everyone involved, and 3, having some of the most memorable stunts and action set pieces keeping me on the edge of my seat since my teens. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to see more of these video essays, please consider becoming a channel supporter on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. There are other ways to support this channel, and you can find those links down in the video description. I'll see you at the movies.